say that the majority do.
What kind of cases have you worked on that did not involve blood being part of the result of the murder that was committed?
Sometimes it might be a domestic violence situation, and so there is beating and strangulation, but no actual breaking of the skin causing blood to be released from the body, if you will. But I say typically you do because oftentimes there's stabbing, shooting, or there is a tool used, like a baseball bat, something that is sufficient to cause injuries that lead to bleeding.
So it depends on the circumstance.
Absolutely.
For those cases that you've worked on that involve blood, I have some questions.
Okay.
So can cleaning up blood cause it to be less visible to the naked eye?
Yes, it can.
For example, if a victim were to bleed on a couch and the perpetrator then attempted to or did clean up the blood, would it make it less visible to the naked eye?
Yes, it would. It also depends on the type of couch. If it's a leather or leather kind of couch, it's more easy to wipe off that visible staining. If it's a fabric couch or there's blankets around, that can absorb the fluid and make it more difficult to clean and remove. You have to put in a little bit more effort to remove that stain.
So one of the factors is the surface upon which the blood was left.
Yes, that's a factor, as well as the amount of blood. If it's very little, it's easy to clean up. If it's a lot, again, there's more work to be entailed.
What about the substances or the method of cleaning?
That will also impact the efficiency, if you will. If you're just using water, you're effectively diluting that out. But if you are using a cleaning detergent, that is going to break down the DNA while it also will remove it from the surface.
So soap and water, or just water, or bleach would all have perhaps different impacts on the amount of blood left behind and also perhaps DNA evidence.
Yes, it can.
So to put it in more common terms, if you spill toothpaste on your bathroom counter, depends on what you use to clean it up and how diligent you are in cleaning it up.
Correct.
Are there substances that could be used to detect blood when it's no longer visible to the naked eye?
Yes, there are tests available.
What are those substances in your experience?
There are a few different options available, typically to a crime scene unit. There is Blue Star, which is similar to the luminol test, which I believe has been used in this case and testified about previously. They typically have the same kind of principle around them. You prepare your chemical, you darken the room, and then you spray the chemical on the area of interest. And then in the darkness, you will see some chemiluminescence, which is photographed because it's very brief in nature. And what these chemicals are doing is they are interacting with substances. It could be a body fluid, such as blood. It can also be sometimes detergent or food stuff. So it's not very specific. If you remember what I talked about before about presumptive, sensitive but not specific. And so that's why you really need to follow with additional testing once you do that test, because there are other materials that can cause that luminescence to be observed.
So if you do a presumptive positive test results with using phenolphthalein or luminol, you then want to follow up to find out if it's actually blood.
Once you've done that luminol or Blue Star type test, yes, you want to follow up with an additional chemical test like phenolphthalein to further characterize and kind of narrow your focus of what you may be observing.
Is there another test referred to as the Heme Direct or ABA card test that can be done as well?
Yes, there is another test called ABA card, and it's also called HemaTrace, H-E-M-A trace. This is kind of like a pregnancy test card where 2 lines is positive, 1 line is negative. It is more specific than that phenolphthalein test. However, higher primates can also give a positive reaction because it's more specific to humans. So higher primates are closely related to us. And interestingly enough, ferrets will also give a false positive.
And when you were at the crime scene on November 29th, 2012, were you aware that phenolphthalein, luminol, and the ABA card were being used at the scene, including in the living room by Joe Clayton?
I was aware of that after the fact because I was not involved with the processing at the residence. However, I reviewed Agent Clayton's report because I was mentioned in there as I responded to process the vehicles. So from Agent Clayton's report and notes, yes, I understand that luminol, phenolphthalein, and that hematrace tests were performed in the house.
And with each one testing positive, what's the likelihood of, or what could cause a false positive result for all three? You mentioned a higher primate.
Yes, so if all three tests for the same stain of interest are positive, it is more likely to be human, but again, there could be that higher primate and there could be a ferret having a cross reaction.
So we have to account for the possibility that it could be orangutan, chimp, or ferret in the living room.
Yes, technically that is possible because they can cause a false positive reaction.
And these liquids can indicate a presumptive positive test for blood after it's been cleaned.
Yes, depending on the quality of the sample that is remaining. So the quality and quantity. These tests have limits of detection, which means perhaps there was blood there, but it's been removed and diluted so much that the test can no longer detect it.
So I'll ask you a hypothetical, okay?
Okay.
Assume for a moment last night I'm looking over things for court today and Mr. Johnson's in the room with me and an argument ensues, he assaults, he kills me, and as a result I'm never heard from or seen again. Social media, email, friends, family, I'm gone. Mr. Johnson obviously knows blood can be incriminating evidence in a case, and he begins to clean up the blood. What are the factors that would determine whether it was made invisible to the human eye, detectable by using one of these tests that we've talked about, or completely gone? What are the factors you would look at?
Asked and answered at the beginning of this part.
I'm going to let him do it. Go ahead. Thank you, Your Honor. Go ahead, ma'am.
So the main factors are the amount of blood that has been released from the body, so small versus medium or a lot. The next factor would be the method of cleaning and what is used. Bleach is very efficient at cleaning and removing surfaces. That's what I use in my laboratory to clean my bench top in between items of evidence. It's great at getting rid of DNA. Other detergents are also effective, cleaning sprays, those sort of products. So it's amount of blood released, type of cleaning product used, the vigorousness of the cleaning, as I mentioned. Is it a cursory cleaning or is it a more thorough, deep cleaning? And then the other factor, as I mentioned, is the surface type that it's deposited on. If it's a smooth surface, that's much more easy to clean and remove visible signs, as opposed to a fabric that might absorb and soak. As far as the detection for the chemical test, I would say that all those factors then come into play for those chemical tests on if you're going to observe a reaction from those different tests that can be performed.
What about if the surface is a new wood floor?
For a wood floor, it is relatively smooth. However, if you've ever gotten a splinter, you know that there's still some grooves in the floor. There's space for fluid to seep in. And so it might be difficult to get all the way down in to clean and remove that.
Let's move to your response to the crime scene on November 29th, 2012.
Yes.
Fair to say you were part of a team including FBI, CBI, the Plata County Sheriff's Office, and others that responded on November 29th?
Yes, that is fair to say.
And I believe when we left off on Friday, you had already started to talk about your role on that day being to help search 2 trucks that belonged to the defendant pursuant to a search warrant authorized by the court. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Can you just walk the jury through in your own words what happened with regards to the 2 trucks, and then I'll ask you some follow-up questions.
Certainly. The trucks were towed to, I believe, a fire station because it was an indoor garage space, so it would be a lot easier for us to work. We began by reviewing the search warrant, which is typically what you do to make sure that the search warrant aligns with what you're supposed to search. You don't want to search the wrong vehicle compared to the search warrant. The search warrant also details the scope of the search. What are you allowed to look for, and what are you actually looking for? In this case, it was the clothing and belongings that Dylan Redwine was last believed to have been wearing or had on his person, anything related to his property, and any possible evidence of a crime, so kind of a catch-all. Their blood, body fluid, anything amiss in the truck. We began by taking overall photographs. We want to record the vehicle, the residence, whatever it is, as it is when you walk into it without having disturbed anything. Then you begin to search it methodically. Again, photographs are taken as you process it, removing layers of things, if there are layers stacked, to show the progression and the position of anything as it was in place before you moved it, in case you do find something of importance. You want to be able to document where it was originally found. We did all that. For each truck, we also took, I believe I myself did this, I applied sterile water to the swabs, so those long Q-tips, but they're sterile, and I applied it to the passenger seat and performed the phenolphthalein test to determine if there was possible blood evidence that I could not visualize. And those tests were negative. They did not indicate the presence of blood. We also cataloged or documented via photographs what was in the truck beds. There were some discolorations in the truck beds that did not appear to me to be indicative of a blood stain, but in the interest of due diligence, they were tested, and those were also negative.
You find any belongings at all of Dylan Redwine on November 29, 2012, when you searched the trucks?
Nothing of evidentiary value was obtained from either pickup truck, so no evidence was collected. We didn't locate anything of Dylan.
And I'm going to ask you to take a look at what's been previously marked as People's 174 through 184 for identification. Your Honor, may I approach the witness? You may. Do you recognize those, ma'am?
Yes, this is one of the two pickup trucks that I helped document and process on November 29th, the white Dodge pickup truck.
Those photos fairly and accurately depict how the truck looked on November 29th, 2012 at the time of your search?
They do. I believe that these are the initial photographs taken around the exterior of the vehicle, within the truck bed, and then once the doors are open, how the interior appears without having been disturbed by any search process yet.
So these are the photos you took at the start of the process?
The FBI special agent took these photographs, and I recorded in the photograph log what he was taking pictures of.
Thank you. Your Honor, at this time, the people would move 174 through 184 into evidence, please. Mr. Morgan?
No objection.
They'll be admitted. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to publish a few of the photographs for the jury.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to take a look at 175. It's on the screen behind you, but you can also look in front of you, wherever you're most comfortable. You just orient the jury to what we're looking at in 175, please.
Excuse me. This is a front diagonal shot of the Dodge pickup truck from the passenger side.
176.
This is a head-on image of the pickup truck.
80, please.
This is a top-down picture of the bed of the pickup truck.
181 we'll look at next.
This is a shot from the driver's side door as it's open.
182.
And this is again from the driver's side, but is showing the rear passenger compartment.
Again, the papers and things we see throughout the vehicle, those were all in place before you started the search.
Correct. There were a number of papers and just miscellaneous items within the pickup truck.
83.
This is again the back passenger side, so the right side of the vehicle.
184.
And this is the front passenger seat.
You had stated that you applied phenolphthalein in different parts of the truck, is that right?
Yes.
What parts of the truck did you apply phenolphthalein and receive that negative result you testified to?
As I mentioned, there were general swabbings that I took of the passenger seat, which were negative for the presence of blood. And there were a few discolorations in the bed of the truck. I don't remember exactly where, but those again were negative.
Thank you. If the body had been transported within the truck or in the bed of the truck, would blood be left behind?
That would depend on a number of factors.
What are those factors?
So if this body had a bloodletting event, like I said, the skin had broken and blood had started to exit from the body, blood could be transferred into the truck in this hypothetical situation. However, if the body's heart was no longer pumping, that means blood is no longer exiting the body unless gravity is helping it along from the wound. And so if the body's no longer bleeding, less blood could be transferred. If the body is wrapped in some sort of material, now there is a barrier between this body and the biological material, the blood, and the surface that it might be in contact with. And so if there's a barrier there, that will affect if blood is transferred.
So 3 different possibilities in that hypothetical that you just analyzed. One is if the person's bleeding at all. The second is if there was a bloodletting event, was the heart still beating close enough in time that blood is flowing? And then the third is whether the body is wrapped or not.
Those are the 3 off the top of my head. There could be other factors that I'm not thinking of in this moment, but I think that those would be the big ones, especially if blood is present on an object, whether it's a person or some object. If there's something in the way of, like I said, that barrier, then it's not going to be transferred to that other surface. But if there's direct contact, then some transfer is going to occur. But whether or not that transfer is measurable or detectable depends on some of those other factors we had already talked about.
Okay. Do you recall what did you do after the search of the trucks?
After the search of the truck, the FBI special agent took what we call exit photographs. This is to document the vehicles once we have concluded our searching, to show the condition at which we return it, basically. Once we were done with that, I believe some dogs came in and did some analysis, and then once that was done, we left the scene of the fire station. When I say we, that is Agent Bates, my colleague at CBI, and myself. We returned to the residence to communicate with Agent Joe Clayton that nothing of evidentiary value had been obtained or observed or collected, and he advised we were no longer needed at the scene and could return back home to Grand Junction.
And Agent Clayton had been in charge of doing the blood detection and crime scene analysis inside the house.
I believe so. I believe he was operating under the FBI's jurisdiction. So he was in charge of Agent Bates and I as secondary crime scene responders for what we were responsible for and what to do.
So approximately what time did you leave the crime scene?
A little after 5 p.m., we left the crime scene and returned to Grand Junction.
You spent roughly 4.5, 5 hours working on this case, November 29th, 2012, along with the rest of it.
Yes, that is correct.
Now we're going to fast forward through 6 years of your life and bring you to 2018. Were you pulled back into the case in 2018?
Yes, I was.
And for what reason?
A number of items had been tested in DNA back in 2012 and in subsequent years. In 2018, CBI completed our validation of a probabilistic genotyping software called StarMix, S-T-R-Mix. This software tool allows a trained DNA analyst to break down complex DNA profiles into the most likely genetic combinations of who had possibly made up that mixture. It then allows you to apply statistics. It's a much better tool for cases where there are related individuals or complex mixtures compared to the traditional statistical analysis that had been performed. You know, disciplines and science evolve, and so when something better comes along, you want to apply that where you can. And so it was decided by CBI that this particular case would be reprocessed to run it through the StarMix software program. And other cases were treated similarly as well that had past DNA results. We went back and did contemporary DNA analysis and did StarMix.
So, consistent with what was done on other cases, you and the rest of the team at CBI went back and analyzed the results from Rebecca Strub using StarMix.
We could not analyze the same data that Agent Strub had developed because that was a previous chemistry. StarMix was only suitable for use with our latest and greatest chemistry, if you will, for looking at DNA. It's what regions of DNA we are looking at. So we had to reprocess those extracts that she developed in 2012 in this new chemistry to interpret them and then run them through the software.
Latest and greatest, what is that called?
That kit is called Globifiler. You may have heard it before. It has 21 total locations on the DNA strand that it is targeting for amplification. 3 of them are what you can consider a gender marker, so a male or female indicator. 21 locations are actual locations that are targeted because you can use them in statistics.
You mentioned amplification. Can you explain that to the jury, please?
Yes. Amplification is the part of the DNA process where you are targeting specific locations of DNA and making more copies of it. It's kind of analogous to a molecular Xeroxer. So if your entire DNA is this big textbook, I don't want to photocopy 300 billion pages of your textbook. I only am interested in these 24 locations of interest. As far as we know, they don't code for your hair color, your eye color, any medical history, so it's not necessarily privacy-sensitive data, but there are regions of the DNA that are demonstrated to be highly variable between unrelated individuals, which makes them a very powerful tool when you are trying to apply statistics and make comparisons.
And what's the ideal amount that you're looking to analyze when it comes to DNA?
The amount varies. We have what is called an optimum input range to put into this amplification reaction. Because if you put in too little, you have lower quality DNA results. If you put in too much, you've overloaded your sample in an essence, and there's too much DNA there, you can't reliably interpret that. So you want to find what we call the sweet spot for that optimal range. That is for Globifiler, between 250 picograms and 1,000 picograms, or 0.25 nanograms and 1 nanogram.
And swabs are used generally for collecting what might provide DNA samples.
Typically, yes, an item may be swabbed using that technique I described where you apply sterile water and rub it on the surface. Depending on what it is, you could also take a cutting. Like if I had an article of clothing with some sort of stain of interest, I might cut it instead of swab it to try to get the most that I can from that sample.
What if you receive a swab that has too robust a profile, too much DNA? What do you do then?
I just want to back up just a moment and explain the general DNA process, because we hit amplification, but that's kind of in the middle. The first step is extraction, where chemicals are added to the sample, such as your step swab, the cutting. This is to break open the cells and isolate and purify the DNA. The second step is quantitation. This is where the total human and total male DNA is estimated within a sample. So it's not hard and fast true, this is an estimate. By knowing the quantitation value, now you know what to use for your amplification. If your sample, let's say it's from a tissue source that has a lot of DNA present, you can very easily put too much into your third step, amplification. So you need to dilute it down with a neutral chemical. So basically it doesn't really have an impact on the reaction. It just means that you're not going to overload your amplification. So when you have a robust sample source, especially with a DNA reference, some sort of body fluid, you need to dilute to get into that optimum DNA range. And then the fourth step is when that amplified product is run on an instrument called a genetic analyzer. Its data is put through a software program that allows you to visualize the representation of that DNA data for that profile. So we analyze and interpret our items of evidence before we look at our references. Once we have analyzed that data, the back end is where star mix comes into play.
Thank you. And in your review of this case and your work on this case, was there enough DNA here for the analysis and comparison that you just described into the process?
Yes. For the samples reprocessed in 2018, they picked up at that quantitation step. So they were quantified again because we had a new chemistry available. They were amplified and then run through the genetic analyzer.
You explained to the jury they heard a little mention of degradation on Friday. Can you explain to the jury what that is, please?
Degradation is when your DNA sample is starting to break down. Remember when I mentioned about those 21 different regions of DNA that I'm looking at for statistics? They vary in size. Some are smaller than others and some are larger than others. Degradation is when the DNA will start to break up. And so it'll start to break up those larger pieces first, and you'll start to lose that genetic information at the larger locations that you're testing for. The smaller locations are hardier because they're already smaller, and they are better able to withstand degradation. But over time, you could lose pretty much everything, given enough time, heat, moisture, you know, those big negatives for DNA preservation.
Are items that are sent to the lab preserved in a manner to ensure that they could be tested in later months and years?
Yes, when items come into the laboratory, they were either stored at room temperature, which is really stable for DNA. We have humidity control, so it doesn't get too much moisture, which can cause bacterial growth. We also have temperature control, so room temperature doesn't mean 80 degrees. Once DNA is extracted, it is kept for the short term in the refrigerator. For example, while I'm actively processing a case, it's in the refrigerator. But once I'm done with my analysis, it goes in the freezer for long-term storage. And this is to protect the DNA from further degradation. Because if you thaw it out and then refreeze and then thaw it and refreeze, that can actually have a negative impact. So you want to minimize the number of times you do that in excess.
So when we talk about degradation, generally speaking, we're talking about DNA that's left at a scene or left outdoors for a lengthy period of time.
Yes, degradation can still be occurring in the laboratory. Like if there is bacterial growth already on that item, we try to halt it by putting it in the refrigerator, but that might not completely stop it. But we do as much as we can to kind of pause whatever may be occurring in that sample. And so most of it, yes, happens prior to collection. Was it exposed to the sun, to rain, cleaning effects? Because cleaning will break down the DNA. And that's why, like I said, we use bleach in the laboratory, because it's really great at breaking down DNA, cleaning it, and removing it so that I have a sterile surface to work on.
And the samples, the evidence that was reviewed in 2018 and put through Global Filer and StarMix had DNA sufficient for your analysis?
They did, yes. For all of the samples reanalyzed in StarMix, they had sufficient DNA to where they were diluted for an optimum input of 500 picograms into the amplification reaction with Global Filer.
With regards to item 2, was StarMix used on item 2?
StarMix was not used on CBI item 2.
What's the reason for that?
The
Protection Foundation, Miller, who did this analysis.
All right, I understand. Can you, ask that question, please?
Sorry, Your Honor?
In terms of who did this analysis, whether or not it was this witness or somebody else?
Sure. Did Rebecca Strub analyze item 2 and produce DNA results related to the evidence that was recovered from the defendant's living room in 2012?
Yes, she did.
And as part of your work on the case, your review of all the work on the case in 2018 and 2019, did you also review Rebecca Strub's work on item number 2 in deciding whether it should go or needed to go through StarMix?
Yes. The technical leader at the time, Sarah Miller, and myself as assistant technical leader, evaluated the DNA results that had been previously developed, in this case in particular, to discuss what samples should be resubmitted and reprocessed for Global Filer and StarMix. We both agreed that item 2 did not need to be reprocessed.
What's the reason for that?
The reason for that was that the DNA profile developed from item 2 was a single source DNA profile that was consistent with, I believe, Dylan, and statistics had been provided. There was no added benefit to doing more work on that sample. StarMix wasn't going to give anything more that the original analysis hadn't provided, aside from a different statistic.
Is it fair to say you used StarMix on the mixtures that have been developed in the DNA analysis performed by Rebecca Strub?
Yes, all the samples that were reprocessed were mixtures.
And who was in charge of bringing StarMix online within CBI? In other words, who was looking at it, the training, the analysis, proficiency exams, and so on? Who was involved in that process?
The technical leader at the time, Sarah Miller, and myself co-chaired the validation committee. This committee was made up of analysts from all of our representative laboratories, at least one from each, because StarMix is a very big undertaking. We had to develop a lot of mixture profiles of both related and unrelated individuals to test the system, determine its limitations and its suitability for casework within the CBI laboratory. Any lab that's going to bring on a probabilistic genotyping system needs to do this internal validation to show that it is fit for use in what manner at their lab. So as I mentioned, I co-chaired and I assisted in designing the experimental design. So what mixtures were we going to test? What ratios of people? How much of one person versus how much of another? The different amounts of DNA that you input, so below our optimum and then above our optimum and within it. You want to test a really broad range that you can. Once we had completed the validation piece, I developed the training plan that all analysts at CBI needed to complete. So this had terms to define, study questions to answer based on our validation, as well as foundational questions about StarMix. Do you understand the program? And as well, I generated the written exams that everyone had to complete, which I graded I graded both those pieces for consistency. And then another committee member created the practical exam that I had to complete as well, and everyone else did. So this is, here are our mixtures, analyze them, interpret them in StarMix. Do you get the expected results when we know what the answer should be? Do you correctly use the software, set up your propositions or scenarios for what you are testing, and do you report the correct likelihood ratio? Because that's important too.
Since that validation process was completed, approximately how many times has CBI used StarMix?
CBI has probably used StarMix since the fall of 2018 in probably over 1,000 cases. I don't have an exact number, but that is our interpretation tool for global filer data. And so it's not hard and fast, you know, if you run global filer, you're running StarMix, but chances are you probably are. So it's been used extensively in casework.
How many cases have you yourself used StarMix since it came online after that validation process?
I did do a search of how many reports I have issued, and it's approximately 70 since September 20th of 2018, which is when I was authorized to do casework. My numbers are a little bit lower because as assistant technical leader, I'm helping with validations and troubleshooting and quality points, so a lot of other things I'm working on. However, most of those 70 cases probably had StarMix results.
And part of your role as assistant technical leader is overseeing the forensic analysts at CBI.
In a technical sense, yes, I participate in the technical review rotation. So I pull cases to review other analysts' work. If individuals have questions about quality or interpretation, they will include me in that communication and I'll work with them on that. So I am pretty heavily involved in quality at the biological sciences section.
CBI is an accredited lab.
Yes, it is.
And as part of CBI's standard protocol, is there someone who's assigned to review the work of the individual who does DNA analysis in the case?
Yes, 100% of the casework performed at CBI is technically reviewed by a second qualified individual.
So in this case, am I correct in saying Sarah Miller was going to do the analysis of certain items of evidence, not item 2, but other items of evidence, and you were assigned to do the review of her work?
Yes, given the timeline of analysis, Sarah Miller as technical leader was going to author the report, and then myself as the assistant technical leader would perform the technical review of it.
And did you in fact review all of her analysis and findings in this case?
I did, thank you.
Looking for another water, ma'am?
I have one for you.
There's one right down in front of you on the right, actually. If you want.
I'll save that. Thank you.
Did you agree with the findings and analysis that Ms. Miller had conducted?
Yes, I reviewed the data that had been generated and any edits to that data, because when you generate a DNA profile, you have DNA peaks, but sometimes you also have artifact peaks. And so I needed to confirm that I agree with what was determined to be true DNA versus not true DNA and remove. I then also had to go through each StarMix analysis that had been run to determine if I agreed with the propositions that had been tested, what scenarios were set up by the software, and the report from the software, that deconvolution or output report, and then all the comparisons that had been made in the case.
And in preparation for your testimony today, did you have an opportunity to look at a diagram that captures the results that you reviewed, as well as the results that you produced in your analysis?
Yes, I did.
Jury heard from Sarah Miller on Friday. She was racing out to get a plane, but they heard from her. And to move us through this process a little bit more quickly in terms of Ms. Miller's work, your review, and your work, I'm going to ask you to take a look at what's been marked as People's 341 for identification and previously shown to defense counsel. Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
Thank you.
Do you recognize 341 for identification?
Yes, this has been shown to me in pretrial preparation.
Does it fairly and accurately depict the results of the star mix analysis conducted by Ms. Miller and yourself in 2018, 2019 regarding this case?
These do summarize the results from 2018 and 2019 in part. So it's not every star mix analysis for each item. It is one for each of them. But the numbers reported are accurate for the scenario tested. So who's a possible contributor?
We'll go through the entire analysis, but to the extent that this captures those items and the analysis listed on the diagram, is that accurate?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, people move 341 into evidence.
Mr. Bogan?
Objection is cumulative. Ms. Miller testified to all these items last week,
Okay.
and to these numbers, I'm sorry.
I think this would be helpful for the jury. They're going to get a lot of evidence, and I know my notes aren't great, but this, I think as a summary would be very helpful, so I'm going to allow it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, may I publish 341 to the jury?
You may.
So, ma'am, we're going to zoom in on CBI item number 3 and start with that, or item 3.1. And if you need to refresh your recollection and look at your reports at any point, you can do so. The jury's heard some of this evidence already from Ms. Miller, so I'm going to move us along quickly, but as you have already, you should correct me if I'm going too fast or you need to give more detail to the jury, okay?
Okay, thank you.
You summarize the star mix analysis on item 3.1.
Would you like just the information on People's Exhibit 341 or the total data?
You could briefly summarize the total data leading us up to what the jury sees on Exhibit 341. That'd be terrific.
Certainly. Your Honor, may I reference Agent Miller's report dated 2018?
Would that assist you in making your determination?
Yes.
And is that the type of information you'd normally rely upon to reach an opinion?
Yes.
You're allowed to.
Thank you. I'm referencing the CBI report dated October 3rd, 2018 for item 3.1. This was the swabs of the floor under the rug/coffee table, which indicates a mixture of 2 contributors. The DNA typing results for item 3.1 are at least 1.9 quintillion times more likely if they originated from Corey Redwine and an unknown, unrelated individual than if they originated from 2 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Corey Redwine is a contributor to this DNA profile. The DNA typing results for this item are at least 1.6 sextillion times more likely to be observed if they originated from Dylan Redwine and an unknown, unrelated individual than if they originated from 2 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Dylan Redwine is a contributor to this DNA profile. The next paragraph is what is represented in People's Exhibit 341. The DNA typing results for this item are at least 490 tridecillion times more likely if they originated from both Corey and Dylan than if they originated from 2 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that both Corey and Dylan Redwine are contributors to this DNA profile. Elaine Redwine, David Stone, and Mark Redwine are excluded as potential contributors to this DNA profile.
Does StarMix also assign proportions or percentages to its results?
Yes, that is part of what StarMix does when it breaks down a mixed DNA profile. What it's attempting to do is to determine what possible combinations of genetic information could end up with this observed data. As part of that, it estimates what are called mixture proportions. So if you have two people present in a mixture, what proportion of each adds up to 100%, basically, for 3 people, for 4 people.
And what do those proportions or percentages represent?
Those mixture proportions or percentages represent the estimation of what one contributor is putting into the DNA profile versus another contributor. So is someone contributing more genetic information or less or approximately equal?
Are you able to tell through Global Filer or StarMix how the DNA is being left behind, whether it's blood, semen, trace, touch DNA, and so on?
No, StarMix cannot break it down by source, if you will. Is it touch DNA or blood or semen? That's not something that the software does.
I just want to be clear when we're talking about percentages. When we talk about the likelihood, correct me if that's not the right word, but the likelihood that Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine are contributors to this item 3.1, that's that at least 490 trait day cillian number.
I do have to slightly rephrase that question because for the likelihood ratio, it's really important that it is presented and verbalized appropriately. Otherwise, you start to run the risk of misapplying the statistic, if you will. So that number, the trait day cillian number, that's related to the probability of observing that DNA profile is approximately 490 trait day cillian times more likely if both Corey and Dylan are contributors rather than 2 unknown, unrelated individuals.
Probability is 490 trait day cillian in the way you just described.
The probability of the evidence if those 2 individuals are tested as contributors.
The percentage is StarMix trying to figure out how much DNA each person contributed to the sample.
Yes, when StarMix does its breakdown, it attempts to assign an estimate for the mixture proportion of each contributor you've said is in StarMix, as well as the relative peak height, which I don't know if you've heard about before, but a peak height on the DNA profile is just the intensity of that data. So StarMix tries to provide a correlation between what percentage is contributor 1 and what is the intensity of the DNA data associated with that person on average, as well as a degradation factor. StarMix also takes into account degradation when it is modeling the DNA profile.
So let me give you an analogy, and you tell me if it's not accurate, okay?
Okay.
If I pour a quart of oil and a glass of chocolate milk in a bucket, and then you're trying to figure out the probability that there's oil and chocolate milk in the bucket, that's that 490 trait day cillian number.
That's a fair analogy. The probability of observing that liquid mixture if it contains chocolate milk and oil.
And then the percentages produced by StarMix are trying to determine how much oil and how much chocolate milk are in the bucket.
Yes, StarMix is trying to provide that information relative to the DNA profile as to how much of each contributor is estimated to be present.
We're going to move to 5.1 now and go through the StarMix results for 5.1.
So this again is from the CBI report dated October 3rd, 2018. The DNA profile developed from the swabs of the floor in front of the love seat south cushion indicates a mixture of 3 contributors. These DNA results for this item are at least 400 times more likely if they originated from Mark Redwine and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals than if they originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides moderate support for the proposition that Mark Redwine is a contributor to this DNA profile. The DNA typing results for this item are at least 72 quadrillion times more likely if they originated from Corey and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals than if they originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Corey Redwine is a contributor to this DNA profile. The DNA typing results for this item are at least 80 quintillion times more likely if they originated from Dylan and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals than if they originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Dylan is a contributor to this DNA profile. These next results are what is represented on People's Exhibit 341. This is the combination test, if you will. So we have multiple individuals with inclusionary likelihood ratios, which means greater than 2. And so we do what I call a fit test. Can they fit and coexist in this sample together? The DNA typing results for this item are at least 60 duodecillion times more likely to be observed if they originated from both Corey and Dylan and an unknown, unrelated individual than if they originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that both Corey and Dylan are contributors to this DNA profile. Though there is moderate support for the individual inclusion of Mark Redwine to this mixed DNA profile, all 3 of these individuals cannot be present in the mixture together. Elaine Redwine and David Stone are excluded as potential contributors to this DNA profile.
Now, you talked at length with the jury on item 3.1 about the percentage or proportion assigned by star mix and what that means. With item 3.1, what were the percentages assigned by star mix to Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine on 3.1?
For item 3.1, star mix estimated that contributor number 1 was approximately 54% contribution, and contributor 2, therefore, was 46% contribution. So they've got to add up to 100. In this item, Corey aligned best with contributor 1 at 54%, and Dylan aligned best as contributor 2 at 46%.
That's item 3.1.
Correct. These are the results for item 3.1.
What does that mean in a way that the jury can understand? You have 54% listed for Corey Redwine and 46% listed for Dylan Redwine.
I would say that these are roughly equal. It's a pretty even mixture of these 2 individuals. And reviewing the DNA data, the electropherogram that had been generated, it also looks roughly equal. And so star mix does a better job than my eyeballs, where I say roughly equal. And so it gave a more precise estimate because it takes into account the amount of DNA that is being input, the peak height intensities that it's observing, and possible degradation effects. It does a lot more calculations than I can easily do as a human.
What were the results in terms of the percentages or proportions that star mix generated for item 5.1?
For item 5.1, it was a mixture of 3 individuals. Contributor 1 was estimated to be 63%. Contributor 2 was estimated at 36%. And I failed to write down contributor 3. However, by doing some math, that has to be around 1%. So that third contributor is represented very minimally in the DNA profile if they're contributing roughly 1%. And that does align with what I see in that DNA profile. There are 2 predominant contributors and then a third trace contributor.
Were the 2 predominant contributors to 5.1?
When Mark Redwine's DNA profile was compared, if you recall, his proposition resulted in moderate support. He aligned with contributor 1, who was estimated at 63%. Dylan was also in alignment with contributor 1 at approximately 63%. Corey Redwine aligned with contributor 2 at approximately 36%, according to StarMix.
The impact of having family members, particularly male family members, in StarMix's analysis?
So regardless of the gender, when you have family members present in a mixed DNA profile or their references available, you increase the risk of what is called obtaining an adventitious result. This is because as related individuals, you share more genetic information than you do with an unrelated individual because of how DNA is inherited, half from mom, half from dad. We analyzed related mixtures in our StarMix validation study, and this included parent-child-child mixtures, parent-parent-child, parent-parent-child-child, which are some of the most difficult you can create because everyone is sharing the same information.
We have here the probability that Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine and an unknown unrelated individual are present in item 5.1 at least 60 duodecillion times more likely.
Again, forgive me for rephrasing slightly. These DNA results are at least 60 duodecillion times more likely to be observed if they originated from Corey, Dylan, and an unknown unrelated individual than if they originated from 3 unknown unrelated individuals.
And StarMix subsequent does the analysis trying to determine the percentage of DNA from the sample.
StarMix attempts to give does give the mixture proportions up front. When you first run a profile through StarMix, and it's what we call deconvolution, where it's trying to tease apart this DNA profile into its most probable combinations. It provides that estimate at the very beginning.
So these are 2 separate numbers, though, is my point. So we're talking about the probability number on the screen and then the StarMix percentages.
Yes, those are different numbers.
Let's turn to item 6.1, the swab of the coffee table. The analysis indicate a mixture from 2 contributors at least?
Yes, this profile was run through StarMix as a mixture of 2 contributors. These DNA results for this item are at least 560 septillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark Redwine and an unknown unrelated individual than if it originated from 2 unknown unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Mark Redwine is a contributor to this DNA profile. These DNA results for this item are at least 54 quintillion times more likely to be observed if they originated from Dylan Redwine and an unknown unrelated individual than if they originated from 2 unknown unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Dylan is a contributor to this DNA profile. So these likelihood ratios I'm talking about are like the individual fit tests for each person individually. And then again, we do that, what I call fit tests. Do they fit together? Can they coexist with the observed data? This next result is what is represented here in People's Exhibit 341.
Your Honor, I'm going to object as to cumulative. I think the process here is she's reading Ms. Miller's report, then reading the exhibit on the screen, and then going back to Ms. Miller's report.
No, I think I've already ruled on that, and I'm going to keep the same ruling, so go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Go ahead, ma'am.
The next result, as I mentioned, is represented here. The DNA typing results for this item are at least 500 quattrodecillion times more likely to be observed if they originated from both Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine than if they originated from two unknown, unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that both Mark and Dylan Redwine are contributors to this DNA profile. Elaine Redwine, David Stone, and Corey Redwine are excluded as potential contributors to this DNA sample.
Thank you. Let's go back to the hypothetical I presented to you earlier. Working on the couch last night, Mr. Johnson comes infuriated with me for some reason, assaults, kills me, disposes of the body. You talked about the surface, the cleanup, the different factors that could go into whether blood is going to be visible or detected and whether DNA will be left behind.
Okay.
What if, after he disposes of my body, I'm never heard from again, email, social media, family, friends, I'm gone. And 7 days or 10 days goes by and law enforcement is aware Mr. Johnson's the last person we've seen alive, okay?
Okay.
But during that 7 to 10 day period, he's been in and about the living room that I was working in, sitting on the couch, moving about, living his life in that living room. What impact does that have on any subsequent DNA analysis? What would you expect to find?
It still, as I mentioned, depends on a lot of those factors. So as time goes on, if there are other people present in that environment, they are leaving behind traces of themselves. The amount depends on the source of DNA. If they are sneezing or coughing, that is going to release more DNA than just sitting in a chair, for example. Also, with the passage of time, time doesn't have a good effect on DNA. And so if the living room is a protected environment, then it might not have too much of a detrimental effect. But it just depends as time goes on, as usage happens, and so on.
Do you expect to find Mr. Johnson's DNA in the living room if he'd been living there for the days, months preceding my murder and the days following the murder before law enforcement shows up?
If it was, in this situation, Mr. Johnson's living room or a friend's house where he had access to, then yes, he could be an expected individual to be present on those samples.
Well as other individuals who'd been in the living room previously or subsequent to the murder?
Certainly.
And with regards to item 6.1, what proportion or percentage did Star Mix assign to this item of evidence?
StarMix provided a mixture proportion estimate of 84% for contributor 1 and 16% for contributor 2. So contributor 1, again, would be the predominant contributor here.
And Elaine Redwine, David Stone, and Corey Redwine are excluded as potential contributors. The mixture on the screen is item number 6.
Correct.
Let's turn now to item 1.1, please. Can you walk us through the use of Star Mix with regards to item 1.1?
For item 1.1, StarMix was initially performed in 2018 on Agent Miller's report. For that analysis, it was assigned a mixture of 3 contributors, and so it was tested as such. Subsequent to that report, so afterwards, we received a request from defense counsel to retest item 1.1 in StarMix as a mixture of 4 contributors, assuming the presence of Mark Redwine. Myself and Agent Miller evaluated this request to determine if it was appropriate, because we do say in every report that has StarMix that additional scenarios may be tested, please contact the undersigned scientist. We don't always know what scenarios or hypotheses are of interest in a case. We try to test the best ones that we can, but we can always test more if they are appropriate. So as I mentioned, a defense counsel request came in to perform additional analysis, and we determined that this was an appropriate test to perform for that office and issue a report.
How did the mixture in 1.1 compare to the mixtures in 3.1, 5.1, 6?
The mixture from 1.1, we originally indicated was a mixture of 3 contributors. There was another sample that we also reported as indicating 3 contributors. However, item 1.1, I would characterize as a more complicated DNA mixture compared to the other DNA profiles developed in GlobalFiler.
So more complicated than 3.1, 5.1, and 6.1 to some degree.
Yes, I would agree with that.
What made it more complicated in 1.1's mixture?
For item 1.1, there was more DNA detected that supported the estimation or assignment of 3 contributors. If we go back to the other profile that we reported as indicating a mixture of 3 was item 5, the floor in front of the love seat south cushion. For that mixture, there were 2 predominant contributors and 1 trace level contributor. It was a more straightforward 3-person mixture to evaluate manually and with star mix. For 1.1, there is more DNA detected supporting at least that 3rd contributor. And with the related individuals that are involved in this case, it adds to that complexity because with related people, you are sharing DNA. So if you are both present, there could be some what we call masking of information because we both have the same, my brother and I might have the same information at some of these locations we look for, and it might be more difficult to tease us apart.
How does that look in practical terms when you're looking at the results? How does that masking look?
When you have 2 unrelated individuals, at one location, you can see up to 4 DNA peaks, 1 from mom, 1 from dad from person 1, 1 from mom, 1 from dad for person 2. And if they're all different, you see 4 peaks. When you have related individuals, at the most you see 3 because they have to be sharing some information from mom and dad. Sometimes you only see 1 peak because everything is shared, or 2 peaks, or 3 peaks. But unless there's a rare mutation event, you don't see 4. So with the higher degree of sharing, that means that that DNA, I think I talked myself into a circle there, I'm sorry. So with sharing, instead of having that information spread across 4 peaks, it's only represented in 3 or 2 or 1. And so by masking, that means 2 people are sharing 1 peak. And so that peak might be a little bit higher than the other 2.
And you're looking at these peaks on an electropherogram?
Yes, that is what we call the visual representation of the DNA profile. It's a little bit like a heart EKG where you have the line and then those peaks. We have multiple color channels of the flat lines where there's no DNA, and then with this where we have the locations that we've tested for, you should see peaks representing DNA that is detected.
So fair to say for item number 1.1, for that particular piece of evidence, it's a more complicated mixture than others in this case, or if you had a case where there were different strangers involved.
Even if this case didn't have family members, say for example, they were all unrelated individuals, item 1.1 would still be a more complex mixture based on the DNA detected.
What did Sarah Miller's work produce that you reviewed in terms of her results?
With Agent Miller's report, where we ran item 1 through StarMix as a mixture of 3 contributors. Everyone was excluded aside from Mark Redwine. The DNA typing results for this item are at least 11 quintillion times more likely to be observed if they originated from Mark Redwine and 2 unknown unrelated individuals than if they originated from 3 unknown unrelated individuals.
So fair to say Ms. Miller's report concluded there were at least 3 contributors to the mixture in 1.1.
Yes.
Then the defense makes a request, and what was the request of CBI?
The defense request received in, I believe, June of 2019 was to test this particular sample as a mixture of 4 contributors and assuming Mark Redwine's presence, his DNA presence, and then determining if Corey and Dylan could fit into that mixed DNA profile given those other factors.
Based on your review of the evidence in this particular case, did it make sense to then run that test with Mark Redwine assumed as a contributor to item 1.1?
Ms. Miller and I met to evaluate this request to determine if it is appropriate. We agreed that yes, it was worthwhile to test this profile as a 4-person mixture before, and it was also, I should state that the reason I performed this testing was based on the jury trial date at that time. Ms. Miller would be on family medical leave, so she would not be available to testify. And so that's why I did this analysis and report. So first, what I did was I took the exact same data from item 1.1 that Ms. Miller used back in October of 2018, and I ran it through StarMix as a 4-person mixture. I did not start off assuming Mark Redwine's presence. I expected him to still fit within that mixture as a 4-person, but to do due diligence and take appropriate steps, I wanted the software to show me that. So I had the deconvolution for that 4-person test for item 1. The diagnostics and StarMix breakdown looked okay. I proceeded with comparing Mark Redwine's DNA profile for that breakdown. He was again included and aligned with contributor number 1, which corresponded to what I thought I should see. So StarMix and I were in agreement there. My next step was to deconvolute item 1 as a 4-person mixture and assuming Mark Redwine's DNA profile. For StarMix, think of the DNA profile like a jigsaw puzzle. If you tell StarMix, here is 1 or more of your contributors, I'm solving 30%, half of the puzzle for you. It's a lot easier to fill in the rest of those jigsaw pieces. It's the same principle for StarMix. When you give it more information, it has an easier time figuring out the rest. So StarMix did its breakdown for that 4-person mixture, assuming Mark Redwine. Again, I checked those diagnostics, those breakdowns. They seemed okay. I accepted those results, and I proceeded with comparing each individual reference individually, just like what was done in every other sample and profile in this case.
So you mentioned that when you first were running it, you expected to see Mark Redwine in the results.
I expected to see his possible contribution supported by a likelihood ratio, yes.
What was the reason you expected that?
I expected that based on the original 3-person results that Ms. Miller had developed, as well as my visual evaluation of the DNA profile data, and also my agreement that it is reasonable to expect Mark Redwine on his own living room.
And what is the deconvolution process that you went through here? Can you just explain what that means?
Deconvolution is what StarMix is doing when it is trying to break down a mixed DNA profile into its most probable combinations of genetic information that gave rise to that observed data. When it goes through this process, it's almost like you're at the eye doctor when it develops a conceptual DNA profile and it says, is this a good fit or a bad fit? number one or number two? Is it a better explanation of the data from what I had before? Yes or no? If it's a better fit, StarMix always says, great, I'm going to use that as my next starting point to keep trying to model this DNA profile. Every now and then, it'll take what they call a cold guess. Think about if you're trying to climb a mountain. If you only take steps up, you're going to end up on a small outcropping or knoll. You're not going to end up summiting your 13er or 14er. But if you allow yourself to sometimes take a step down, you end up summiting your mountain. That is the good space that StarMix is trying to sample from to develop the components of that mixed DNA profile.
What were the results of the StarMix calculations with regard to the complicated mixture that you described from item 1.1 in your analysis?
As a four-person mixture, assuming Mr. Mark Redwine, contributor 1, which is always your assumed individual, was estimated to represent 69% of the mixture. Contributor 2 was estimated to be at 26%. Contributor 3 was at 3%. And once again, I forgot to write down contributor 4. But doing math, that's probably around 1 to 2% for contributor 4.
And what do we see on Exhibit 341 regarding the results from that StarMix analysis? We'll start with that.
So these are from my report dated July 19th of 2019. I'm going to go through the individual likelihood ratios and then different fit tests to determine who can coexist in that mixture together. So we're talking about the DNA profile developed from the swabs of the East couch cushion, and this is being tested as a mixture of 4 contributors, assuming Mark Redwine is present. Assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, this mixture is at least 620,000 times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark Redwine, David Stone, and 2 unknown unrelated individuals than if it originated from Mark Redwine and 3 unknown unrelated individuals. This analysis provides strong support for the proposition that David Stone is a contributor to this DNA profile. Mr. Stone was aligning with contributor 3 in this analysis, that 3% approximate. Assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, this mixture is at least 740 million times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark, Corey, and 2 unknown unrelated individuals than if it originated from Mark and 3 unknown unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Corey is a contributor to this DNA profile. In this individual case, Corey was aligning with the second contributor, estimated at 26%. Assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, this mixture is at least 840,000 times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark, Dylan, and 2 unknown unrelated individuals than if it originated from Mark and 3 unknown unrelated individuals. This analysis provides strong support for the proposition that Dylan is a contributor to this DNA profile. Dylan was also best aligning in the contributor 2 spot at estimated at 26% by StarMix. Though there is support for the individual inclusions of David Stone, Corey Redwine, and Dylan Redwine, all of these individuals cannot simultaneously be in this mixture with Mark Redwine.
Can you explain that, please?
Yes, thank you. So for this sample, we are assuming Mark Redwine. So he automatically takes and keeps one of those contributor spots. He's a guaranteed contributor, if you will. We have 3 individuals that are giving us inclusionary likelihood ratio statistics for their individual comparison. So we need to see, can they all fit together? Can they fully explain the data, or does it not fit? In this case, these 3 individuals plus Mark Redwine do not explain the data. StarMix says there's additional genetic information that someone has to have that someone doesn't, and so they don't fit together. This could be for a couple reasons. It could be that one or more of these individuals is being adventitiously included because they are closely related and share that genetic information, or there is an additional contributor that is giving that other data.
So what did you do then?
My last step was then to perform the final hypothesis testing that the defense counsel requested, which was assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, do Corey and Dylan fit in this mixture? The results of that specific scenario test is what is displayed in this exhibit. Assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, this mixture is at least 1.3 million times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark, Corey, Dylan, and an unknown unrelated individual than if it originated from Mark and 3 unknown unrelated individuals. This analysis provides very strong support for the proposition that Corey and Dylan are contributors to this DNA profile along with Mark Redwine.
You produced these results for both the prosecution and the defense in the case?
I produced these results, so this report was generated. It went out to the submitting agency. According to my report, it's the La Plata County Sheriff's Office, and so they would have then disseminated this report to the prosecution office and defense counsel as part of the normal discovery and dissemination of information.
Thank you. Did you receive any additional requests after you produced this report for additional analysis on these items that you testified to today?
CBI did not receive any additional requests for reanalysis or additional hypothesis testing, if you will.
Just to circle back and try to make sure we're all on the same page here. Fair to say when Ms. Miller did her analysis and found at least 3 contributors, she did not assume any particular person to be in that mixture as part of her analysis.
That is correct. Ms. Miller and I discussed if individuals should be assumed in this case because it is the residence of Mr. Mark Redwine. However, we were not sure on what component of each mixture was of probative value. So we approached this more as a blind testing of the DNA results and provided the association to each individual. We hesitated to assume someone's presence because that might not be the proposition or scenario that the relevant parties wanted tested. You know, we didn't want to, in this case, put words in their mouth, so to speak. So we are happy to test alternative hypotheses if they are reasonable and make sense, and this one fit that criteria.
So the test that Ms. Miller conducted originally on item 1.1 was, you described the blinded test.
In a sense, we knew the context of it. We knew it was from the couch in Mr. Mark Redwine's home, but we did not want to assume anyone's DNA presence in that sample because we weren't sure what was of probative value to the relevant parties.
And the request that you received with regards to item 1.1 was reasonable because it's a complicated mixture, and Mr. Redwine was a resident in that living room?
Yes, and it was also reasonable, as we've stated, because there are related individuals at play within this sample. And so they could be sharing genetic information, and it is reasonable to increase the number of contributors to perform that test.
And what proportion or percentages were assigned by star mix on item 1.1?
I went over the individual proportions when I did that so-called fit test for Mark, Corey, and Dylan. Mark was still at contributor number 1. Remember, he's assumed, so he's locked in at that spot. Corey Redwine aligned with contributor number 2 at estimated at 26%. And if you remember, Corey and Dylan were both individually best fit as contributor 2, but you can't have two people exist in the same contributor slot when you test them together. So Dylan got bumped out actually to contributor 4, which was probably around 1%. I forgot to record that number, but I can look it up if needed.
You have that number with you?
I do, it's in my notes.
So suffice to say, when they looked at individually, both Corey and Dylan are identified by Star Mix as contributor 2.
They are identified as the best fit for that contributor 2 spot.
At that 26%.
Correct.
And then when Star Mix is trying to put all of them together, that's when they get that added calculation to share.
Correct. When Star Mix is looking at them all together, it says, well, I can't have two people in one spot. Someone has to move. Can they move? And that's kind of what happened in that 4-person test that included David Stone. You know, someone still had to slide out into contributor 4 or 3, but they all just didn't fit. It didn't work.
Spent a lot of time going over 1.1 now, and I think it's fair to say it's a complicated mixture.
Yes.
Circling back, as part of your work here, you had an opportunity to review the DNA analysis conducted by Rebecca Strub back in 2012 and 2013.
Yes, I reviewed the data she had generated back in 2018 when we were looking to reanalyze this in the new chemistry and with Globofiler and with StarMix. And I briefly reviewed it again in trial preparation.
So for 2018, 2019, you used the new technology of Globofiler, right?
Yes, the new chemistry. Yes.
And StarMix, correct?
Correct.
How did the results from 2018, 2019 compare with the results generated by Rebecca Strub?
In general, they do not appear to contradict each other. Agent Strub developed mixtures. She, in general, was including the same individuals that StarMix included down the line using different data. We did have slightly different results for item 1 as a 3-person mixture in the 2012 chemistry versus the 2018 chemistry. And then that subsequent request for analysis as a 4-person mixture was also in alignment with what was observed in or obtained in that 2012 analysis.
The different system, different technology, but the results do not conflict with what Rebecca Strub generated from 2012, 2013 analysis.
Not that I could see, no.
John, I have nothing further. Thanks very much, ma'am.
Okay. Ross?
Thank you.
If you have any difficulty understanding me or hearing me, Ms. Cheromcha, am I saying that right?
Cheromcha.
Cheromcha, I apologize. Just let me or the judge know. I want to touch on some initial issues you talked about this morning with Mr. Doherty. You started your direct testimony affirming that blood is a DNA-rich material, correct?
Typically, yes.
And you also testified that you've been involved in investigations where there's been bloodletting events, right?
Yes, I have.
And based upon your experience, a bloodletting event, it necessarily includes the breaking of the skin, correct?
Yes, I suppose you could also get, you know, if a nosebleed or something like that. So your skin isn't necessarily breaking on the exterior, but something has broken to cause blood to be released.
Right. So I guess if you have a nosebleed, there's a blood vessel that's busted in your nose or your face or your head somewhere, correct?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And you gave examples, or I think you at least affirmed examples from Mr. Doherty saying examples of a bloodletting event would include a stabbing, shooting, or something with a baseball bat, right?
Yes, those were some examples. There are many more.
Right. We could probably spend the balance of the morning coming up with different scenarios. that would lead to a bloodletting event that would lead to DNA investigation, correct to say?
That is a fair statement.
And I could give a big, long list of these are all the ways that blood gets put on stuff, and you could probably agree with all those, right?
Yes, very likely.
And to reiterate, global filer, star mix, the DNA analysis that happens at CBI Labs does not inform you or any analyst how that DNA material wound up on that surface, correct?
That is correct. It's one of the limitations of DNA analysis that it can indicate who, but typically not how or when.
And not how or when, or in the event of a mixture, in what order, correct?
By order, do you mean time of deposition, if you will? Like this person donated first,
Right.
and then 5 minutes later, this person?
Right. And to make sure everyone's with us, star mix, CBI DNA analysis doesn't inform the analyst that this contributor put his or her genetic material in here first, and then at a later date, this contributor put in their material, and that at an even later date, this contributor put in their material, correct?
Yes, thank you for clarifying. DNA analysis in general cannot do that. So it's not just CBI's analysis, it's DNA analysis in the forensic field at this time.
And the other side of that coin is CBI DNA analysis, star mix can't say these two contributors contributed their genetic material at the same moment.
No, DNA analysis does not give a timestamp, if you will, of when DNA was deposited.
You also talked on direct about how, in your experience with Colorado Bureau of Investigation, how cleanup can affect the visibility of blood. Remember talking about that with Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
And you listed a number of factors that can affect the visibility. And when we're talking about visibility, you were talking about visibility to the naked eye, correct?
Correct. I was referencing, if you look at something, do you see a red-brown staining, and why may you not?
And whether or not a blood stain or any kind of biological stain is visible to the naked eye depends on a very long list of factors, correct?
Yes, there are many.
And you listed a few of them, and those included the amount of DNA material, correct?
Yes.
And I think in your direct testimony, you even referred to, well, it depends on the amount of blood, right?
If blood is what we're speaking about, yes, then the amount of blood. Is it a single drop, or is it a pool? Just examples.
And it's the amount of blood or DNA material, how big that stain is also depends on what it gets deposited on, correct?
Initially, it's going to be the same stain regardless of what it's deposited on, but the ability to clean that up is impacted by the surface that it's on.
Right, and you talked about that, about different fabrics, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree, as being a criminal analyst, DNA expert, and just living in the world we're living in, some fabrics, some surfaces are more absorbent than others, correct?
Yes.
Slick surface, not absorbent. Cloth surface, probably more absorbent. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that is a fair generalization to make.
And, you know, we're talking about visibility, and that's kind of crossing into how long a stain or biological material will remain around before it totally degrades.
Okay.
Thanks. And how long a stain remains visible depends on the fabric, how much there is. It also depends on what the ambient circumstances are where that stain is, correct?
Yes, those are some of the factors we've discussed.
And that can vary from indoors to outdoors?
Absolutely.
And it can vary from room to room within a house as well, correct?
It could, yes. If one is a sunroom with a lot of windows or a greenhouse versus the basement, those have very different ambient temperatures and qualities.
Right. And because inside and outside and different rooms in different houses have different humidity, different exposure to sunlight, different ventilation, we could probably list, again, so many different factors that would affect the speed at which biological materials degrade, correct?
Correct.
And that's why, again, when CBI, Star Mix are looking at a biological specimen, if you will, you can't determine how, when, or in what order that specimen wound up on a particular surface.
That is correct. As I said, that's a limitation of DNA testing in general as a whole for this field at this time.
And as you testified on direct, how long a biological sample exists on any given material can be affected if it is subject to cleanup, correct?
Yes, biological material will stay where it is deposited until it's removed, whether that's from sun, rain, or cleanup, or just a normal passage of time.
And as you've testified, I take it you've done serology work and DNA work, correct?
Correct. I am qualified in serology and DNA and have done analysis in both of those sections, if you will, over the course of my 10 years.
And you even spoke on direct about how at CBI that you all use a bleach solution to clean up your work areas with these materials, correct?
Yes, in between items of evidence, so not just cases, but each item, we clean our work surface with a 10% bleach solution, and then we follow it with an ethanol solution, because that will also, it will remove the bleach residue, and it is also detrimental to DNA, because we want a clean, uncontaminated work surface to work on.
And 10% bleach should take care of most DNA left out on that kind of surface there at CBI, correct?
Yes.
You also testified about presumptive tests for blood. I think you spoke about luminol, phenolphthalein, and the ABA card, right?
Yes, I did.
And you would agree with the statement that luminol is a presumptive test, right?
Absolutely, yes.
It's an indicator, not an identifier, safe to say.
Correct. It allows the crime scene analyst to narrow their focus to a particular area or region of interest. But as I mentioned, it is presumptive because other materials or fluids could cause that reaction to occur.
And what you know from your experience is that luminol can produce false positives, correct?
Yes, it can.
And what luminol does not do is produce false negatives, correct?
In a sense, luminol could produce a false negative if the blood was below its limit of detection that I'd mentioned about before. So that would result in a negative result.
So a negative result from luminol means, one, potentially, there's just no blood there, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Or, in your opinion, there's not enough blood there to be detected.
Correct. That is the same for each of those presumptive tests.
Right.
Either blood is not present or it's below the limit of detection for that test.
But you would agree luminol is very, very sensitive, correct?
Yes, I would agree that it is sensitive.
Do you know what the sensitivity ratio is for the luminol being used by CBI or by Joe Clayton in this case?
I am not familiar with that value.
And those values can be expressed in forms of ratios like 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000, 1 to 100,000, 1 to 1,000,000, correct?
Correct. That is typically how those limits of detection are communicated.
And because luminol is seeking to find stuff that's not visible, it's designed to be very, very sensitive, right?
Yes, I agree with that statement.
But again, you can't tell the jury how sensitive Mr. Clayton's luminol was.
I did not perform that test, and I have not used it in many years, so I'm not familiar, unfortunately, with that particular value.
And safe to say it's not uncommon for when samples make it to the CBI lab for there to be a secondary test on serology to see if this sample, this biological material, this swab, if you will, tests positive for blood, right?
Yes, that oftentimes happened where in the field, serological tests were performed, whether it was luminol or phenolphthalein, or other tests, because say, for example, they were looking for semen. They would be doing chemical tests for semen. Oftentimes, those results were repeated within the laboratory to determine if concordant results were obtained.
And when CBI is doing those concordant tests, CBI no longer uses luminol to do that, correct?
I am no longer a part of the crime scene unit, but I believe from conversations, CBI now uses Blue Star rather than luminol for that luminescence test.
Right. CBI used to use luminol. Now CBI uses Blue Star, not luminol, based upon your conversations with folks and your experience with CBI, correct?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, but again, I'm not in the crime scene unit any longer, and so I might not be the best person to answer that question.
And one of the things you said during direct is that luminol will indicate an area that deserves further investigation, correct?
Yes, it's a screening tool that's used.
And as you said on direct, when those swabs come to serology at CBI, it's good to follow up to see if that initial determination by luminol was actually correct, right?
Typically within the crime scene investigation, if an area results in a luminar or Blue Star positive result, I say positive with quotes, that is tested in the field with phenolphthalein or a similar chemical test to determine if it warrants collection, basically. Could it indicate blood or does it not indicate blood? CBI policy has varied over the years, especially with CBI. If a CBI crime scene unit tests for phenolphthalein in the field, do we need to test in the laboratory because we're using the same reagents and same chemicals? And so it used to be it's always repeated. Now over time, some have shifted to where they aren't necessarily repeated because they're using the same chemistry, the same manufacturers. So it really depends on the circumstance and even depends on the analyst. Sometimes a serologist will retest no matter what, even if they don't necessarily have to.
But you guys do retest to see if they got it right in the field, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
You can answer one more time.
Not necessarily right, because we don't know what the correct answer is. It's an unknown sample, but to see if the results in the laboratory are in alignment with what was obtained in the field.
And you gave some examples as to why a test at the CBI lab would be different from a luminol test or a phenolphthalein test in the field. You remember talking about that with Mr. Doherty?
Was that on Friday?
No, that was today. It was this morning. It's already been that long of a morning.
My apologies. Yes, some of the reasons for differences in the test. Yes, thank you for the reminder.
And you listed a couple reasons, and, you know, one reason that a test would be different in the lab than in the field is that the test in the field was a false positive.
Yes, that could be a potential reason.
And, Judge, are we breaking at 10 or?
In there somewhere. How much, you going into a new subject now, or?
I was going to move on to a new subject and ask the vote.
How long is it going to take?
5 to 10.
That's fine, let's do that, and then we'll break.
I'd ask the people to publish prosecution 181, please. And I need to restart my computer. It'll be like 10 seconds. You testified on direct that you were involved in the investigation of a Dodge truck. Remember talking about that a little while ago?
Yes.
And in fact, what I believe you said is that you and several other law enforcement agents investigated a Dodge and a Chevy truck, correct?
Yes, there were 3 of us, the FBI special agent in charge of that search, Lehman, I don't know how to pronounce it, Leyman, Agent Bates with CBI, and myself with CBI. And
those are the 3 of you. We got 3 agents investigating these 2 vehicles, right?
Yes, it was the 3 of us executing the search warrants on those 2 pickup trucks, the Dodge, and yes, I believe the other one was a Chevy.
And I think as you testified, as you explained to the jury, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, there were kind of 2 aspects to this investigation. One was just kind of old-fashioned looking for clues, right?
Yes, kind of that catch-all, any signs of a criminal event was included in the search warrant. Which
would include things like stains, weapons, that sort of thing, correct?
Correct. Stains, weapons, things used to possibly bind someone because at the time they wondered if a kidnapping had occurred, so that was mentioned in the search warrant.
So you're looking for weapons, bindings, stains, anything that might inform law enforcement's idea of what they think happened or what may have happened, right?
Correct to the first part, anything that may help inform a hypothesis to what may have happened.
And you're working in concert with at least 2 other agents here, one from CBI and one from FBI. Did I hear that correct?
Yes.
And drilling down on that aspect of the search here of the 2 vehicles, you didn't find anything of evidentiary value in the Dodge, correct?
That is correct.
And that when I say, we'll go move on. And you didn't find anything of interest in the Chevy as well, correct?
Correct.
And you also testified that you applied, I believe it was phenolphthalein, to the inside cab of the Dodge here as well, correct?
Yes, phenolphthalein to the inside cab passenger seat of both pickup trucks.
Okay. And in 181, it's on the screen behind you. We can probably barely see the passenger seat. Obviously, that's the driver's seat with the steering wheel, correct?
Correct.
And, well, let's look at 182. Maybe that's a better picture of it. Please. And I can stop at 182. Does that appear to be the back seat of the Dodge?
Yes.
Okay. Did you apply any phenolphthalein back there?
May I refer to the crime scene notes from the FBI agent?
By all means.
Thank you.
I have Agent Clayton's report, too, on my screen. I don't know if that helps, but...
I might look at both of them. Thank you.
Permission to approach?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I have refreshed my recollection.
Excellent. Can I come get my laptop?
Yes, please. I'm sorry. I should have caught you earlier. Thank you, sir.
Did you apply phenolphthalein to the back cab of the truck?
Yes, both trucks had swabs collected from the back passenger compartment and tested for phenolphthalein.
Okay, and if I could have the people publish 183, please. And that's safe to say 183 is another view of the back passenger king cab Dodge.
Correct.
Okay. And if the people could publish 184, please. Safe to say 184 is a photograph of the passenger seat, right?
Correct, the front passenger seat.
Right. And you've testified that you applied phenolphthalein to there, correct?
Yes.
And that came back negative, correct?
Correct. All of those general swabbings taken from the passenger seat and the rear passenger compartment did not indicate the presence of blood.
And can you tell from people's 181 through 184 if those are leather seats or fabric seats on the Dodge?
Based on their appearance and my recollection, they are fabric seats.
And you spoke to Mr. Doherty about why or why not there may be blood or presumptive positive tests for blood in the truck. You remember talking about that?
Yes, I recall some of those scenarios, yes.
Right, and he went through a number of, I think, hypotheticals and scenarios with you. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons why blood might not be in a truck, correct?
Correct, there are.
First and foremost, there might not have been a bleeding event in that truck, correct?
Correct.
Or there might not have been someone bleeding in that truck who's alive or dead, safe to say.
Correct, that is one possible explanation.
And you went through a number of factors, and one of them was it depends kind of on how much bleeding is going on. You remember talking about that?
Yes, that is one of the factors.
And that depends, first of all, whether or not someone's bleeding, right?
Correct. They, first of all, have to be bleeding in order to have some blood be released.
And another factor that affects this issue that also affects how big a stain may or may not be is how big the wound is, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
For instance, a paper cut's going to leave less biological material, less blood than, you know, if someone gets an arm severed.
Absolutely, yes.
And based upon your experience in investigating crime scenes, doing work in serology, it's your experience and expertise that head wounds generally tend to bleed a lot, correct?
I don't have a lot of study in the field of physiology as to what wounds bleed more than others, so I can't answer that question.
You can't speak to whether or not a head wound bleeds more than a paper cut.
Your Honor, excuse me, asked and answered. I think there'll be other witnesses on this topic. Thank you.
Okay.
And I think that's a good stopping point if Your Honor's inclined.
Okay, this is a good spot then. Ladies and gentlemen, don't talk about the case while you're on your recess. We'll start up again at 10:20. So everybody rise for the jury. All right, we'll be in recess.